Well, I'm Ginny Burgin, and I'm here today with Steve Thomas. I've worked for City Church Sheffield for a number of years now, and I've worked in the pastoral field as well as in the counselling arena, and have various qualifications in that realm, more to do with general counselling and bereavement counselling, as well as the study of working with people who are terminally ill and being able to help in those sorts of times. My friend here, Steve, welcome Steve, is a local GP, but can you perhaps tell us a little bit about your role?
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone. So Ginny, yes, as you know, I'm indeed a local General Practitioner here in Sheffield, but I also work with the Sheffield Clinical Commissioning Group, which is the local NHS body, and I help to plan and organise the mental health services, learning disability, dementia and autism services for our city, as well as practising clinically as a General Practitioner.
Yeah, so it's quite a role. So today we agreed that we were going to talk about mental health.
Sure.
But what I kind of find these days, Steve, is mental health gets kind of bandied about as a term that actually means mental illness. But actually mental health should in fact mean mental well-being, shouldn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so I just wondered how you have felt about that. In addition to that, what I have found when I'm going to see someone, maybe they feel they're a bit depressed, they're a bit down about something and they want my input. If I feel that they are in fact clinically depressed and need the help of a GP, sometimes it takes me a really long time to convince them to go and see their GP, because there's such a stigma about admitting that I have a mental health problem.
Sure.
So what can you offer on that?
I think you're absolutely right. Language is powerful, isn't it? And we often sort of misuse language, and we tend to use the term physical health to mean our physical well-being, but we tend to use mental health to indicate illness. And actually, we all have mental health, and we all have mental well-being, and we should do, because just as we have physical health and physical well-being, and it is that continuum between sort of what is a normal, healthy reaction to circumstances and situations, which can move into aspects then of reacting, maybe slightly inappropriately sort of to challenging situations, and then moving into maybe injury and maybe into illness as well. So you're right, we tend to not use the terminology well, but we should all appropriate our mental and spiritual and physical well-being. Absolutely agree. And your point about seeking help, you're right. There's a lot of stigma around that, and there's a lot of stigma that tends to differentiate into different groups of people. So for example, men in particular aren't very well, aren't very good at seeking sort of help for mental health or well-being, stress, anxiety. But if we were to just look really briefly at, say, definitions, so the World Health Organization, all the way back in 1948, said, and I'm going to read this out, sort of more than trying to remember it.
Yes, I have that.
Health as a complete state of physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. But that's like really aspirational. I was really aspirational back in 1948, because probably none of us would fall into that definition of wellness. But more recently, even secularly, people have struggled with this definition, and now moving into the area of saying, well, surely it's about the ability to adapt and self-manage in the face of social and physical and emotional challenges. And that might be more helpful because we live with chronic disease conditions, both physically and mentally, and sometimes spiritually as well.
And it's the ability to be able to carry on functioning well, isn't it? In all aspects. But I find that often people think in terms of the physical, sort of stuff to do with the body. They don't think much about the mental unless they have become, they have become depressed or something. Then they think about the spiritual. So in church life, we sometimes, I have found sometimes that people have this demarcation between the physical and the spiritual, as if they're quite detached from one another. But what I have found is that actually whatever it might be wrong with us when we talk about well-being and something being a little bit out of kilter, if it's a physical problem, it can affect how we feel, it can affect how we think, and even affect our spiritual life. If it's a spiritual problem, like maybe we're struggling to forgive someone or something, that can even affect the way we feel and the way we think. And sometimes we can end up in mental health difficulty because of something like that. So for me, it's actually about the fact that we are holistic people, that everything that happens to us has a knock-on effect to all parts of us.
Absolutely. And I think that really identifies some of the thinking that we've had, particularly in the West, over centuries, as we've developed models of illness or medical models. And even sort of in traditional sort of Western medicine, sort of now, we tend to use what's termed the biomedical model. So where doctors and nurses will tend to think about our body ostensibly as a machine, and then our mind and our emotions being almost separate to that. Whereas God never intended and didn't create us in that way. We are definitely whole human beings, and the way in which our mind and body and spirit interact, irrespective of your worldview, we can't escape the fact that we're created in His image, and that mind, body, and spirit sort of interaction is really important. Maybe a good example would be, and I know all analogies will break down when they're stretched and extended, but I think there is value in the hardware, software, sort of analogy of a computer, sort of thinking about brain and central nervous system, the way in which our hormones react, the chemicals that surge around our body, but also then sort of about how we think and feel and react or perceive as a result of being beings that are alive, sort of to spiritual sort of things and to emotional responses. And if something goes wrong with a circuitry in our brain or a chemical, then that can affect how we feel physically, and then that will affect how we feel emotionally and how we interact and react with them. So it's really important, sort of not to just quickly attribute symptoms and signs to sort of, it's definitely this or it's definitely that. So, we could have a faulty, out of kilter thyroid gland, or we could be profoundly anemic and oxygen just isn't going around our body very well. That's going to affect how we feel, how we react, how we feel so fatigued, tired, depressed. Do we need antidepressants in that situation? No, we need our thyroid gland sort of recalibrated. So I agree with you completely.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because I can remember instances when people have sought me out and I've had this sort of small thing with them. Come on, you need to get checked out by a GP. And because they're feeling depressed and don't want to own that, they fight it a bit. But occasionally I've had the person in that position, and when they have gone to see the GP, in the end I've kind of said, well, maybe there's something physical and you need to be checked out. And I can remember on one occasion a lady did have an underactive thyroid, and she'd begun to retreat from life quite a lot and retreat from church life, and because of that she was seen to be someone who was losing her faith. But in fact, the fact that she'd got an underactive thyroid was causing her to just be so low and so lethargic that she hadn't got the energy. And as soon as she was put on the right medication, she was back involved with all that she had been.
Absolutely.
And you know, I find it interesting that the psalmist does say, my soul has had enough troubles, I have become like a man without strength. So sometimes the stuff we're going through, the stuff of life, you know, losing our job or having difficulty with the neighbours, or, you know, not very good stuff going on in the family, it can end up making us feel like a man without strength, that we then begin to feel maybe ill.
Absolutely.
But actually it's because all this thing is going on. So I'm very much feel that we have to battle against people feeling the stigma.
Sure.
And to recognise that it is part of a whole, we are part of, you know, we're whole human beings, and therefore what's happening to us is a part of the whole body, not just the mental health problems. And like I say, about 95% over the years of, let's call it unexplained depression, where there's no trauma in the background, there's no...
So no discernible trigger factor.
Yeah, no discernible trigger.
The loss of job.
But people is, the person is feeling depressed or anxious. Often I find that in those instances, there are a lot of unresolved issues going on, which can be stuff to do with the emotional realm, but it can be stuff to do with the spiritual life. So again, that's where maybe someone is struggling to come to terms with the fact that, well, my faith causes me to say that I should forgive, but this and thus happened and I cannot forgive that. You know, and that's kind of a conflict. You know, my spiritual being is saying forgive, and my brain is saying no, you can't forgive. And there comes that point where we have to resolve that. And I think that those kind of unresolved conflicts are often the root of a lot of people's unexplainable low mood, depression and so on.
And Ginny had also say at that point that those sorts of unresolved conflicts, unforgiveness, sort of that holding on to, a negativity, sort of negative patterns of thinking where we can spiral in that way, can also therefore affect our physical health.
Yes.
And how we sort of react. Isn't it interesting sort of how things like skin conditions can flare up with stressors, sort of, and with other concurrent illnesses as well. So again, proving the fact that we're whole human beings, the fact that our mind and our body and our spirit sort of interact with each other, and then that is the thing that has a knock-on effect to things like our thoughts and our cognition, and into sort of therefore our feelings and how we perceive things. But we are still autonomous human beings, and we've got the ability to make choices. Sort of, and that's where sort of something. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that everything is an individual's fault, therefore, and that they sort of like have ultimate control. We can be so unwell that we haven't got the ability to make decisions. Of course we can. But we're mostly we're in that position where we can act on, sort of in a positive way, with the help of individuals, with the help of our church community and families, and the appropriate interventions of health systems as well, the appropriate care, support and treatment. Because we would never say, I'm not going to take thyroxine, for my underactive thyroid. Of course, God can heal anything, miraculously and instantaneously. I totally believe that. But I also believe that He's given us medicines to be able to deal with certain things.
Yeah. And another thing I find, Steve, is that, again, because of the perceived stigma about having some mental health problem or difficulty, another aspect of that in church life particularly, almost exclusively, is that some Christians feel they'll be labelled as those who have demons. And
Sure.
I don't know what people feel like when they come and consult you. I've heard even the non-Christian describing something as being like having demons inside. And of course, when we feel that we are really battling with something, it can feel like we're having a fight with something, can't it?
Absolutely.
But actually, most of the time it isn't. Sometimes, however, there can be some problem whereby something's gained an opening, a bit like having picked up an infection,
Sure.
Maybe a chest infection or something, having picked up an infection that's just pulling us down and not allowing us to function well. So sometimes the enemy can have gained an entrance in a manner where we're just not functioning well at every level, spiritually, and then of course that moving out into the rest of us like we've been talking about. And just as we need to have medication to sort the problem of a chest infection out, and then the medication after a while, that kind of, let's put it in commas, delivers us from the problem.
Sure.
So sometimes we do need somebody's help, good leaders, pastors and so on, to help us with sorting out the problem of the entrance that the enemy's gained, helping to sort that out, helping to deliver us from where we've been. But there should be no stigma attached to that either.
Absolutely.
So, in my own case, in my own history, which I've written about in the book, and I know you've read it, Overpowering Nemo, I talk about how this was my problem, in that I presented as many different things I was labelled as, but kind of disassociated and not thought to be very able because I didn't display much outwardly.
Sure.
But actually the problem was the abusive family background and the hold that the enemy had gained in my life to keep me within that. And as I found help with that and released from that, wonderfully began to find a way forward with the problems I'd had with mental health. And so I think it is good for there to be this interaction between all forms of people help. The medical practitioners, counsellors, people who work in churches, pastors, leaders, and that we shouldn't, as from my point of view as pastors and leaders, we shouldn't abdicate being involved in someone's life simply because they have a mental health problem.
Yeah.
And I just wondered about your thinking on that.
Yeah. I think you're right. Again, it's back to that almost biomedical model that we tend to think in that way. And even in secular society, sort of that is not medically trained, we tend tend to err more towards that way of thinking. So we see our body, we know about breaks and burns, we know about infections, we know sort of like that even though the other things are hidden, we tend to accept that, oh yeah, anemia means the iron isn't circulating around my body and taking oxygen sort of very well. But when it comes to sort of mental non-well-being, the stress, the anxiety, what would be termed more common mental illness, as well as into more serious, severe mental illnesses, they're hidden. You don't physically see manifestations outside of maybe behavioural manifestations, sort of how people interact. And that's going back to that continuum, of being healthy and reacting normally. We can all sort of identify that. Reacting sort of appropriately. So if we had a tiger in the room now, we would definitely have the fight-flight reaction totally normally.
Yes.
But then we tip into sort of abnormality, maybe being injured and then into illness, when those sorts of levels are just constant for no good reason. So a lot of people will tend to think about the fight-flight reaction, the raised adrenaline, the cortisol surging around your body. But for those individuals, it's happening for no discernible reason. Yes. Whereas it's often been related to sort of the unresolved grief, trauma, stressors that are substantial and significant at that time. And just addressing your point specifically, therefore, about how we as a church body tend to react, we tend to be able to know how to deal with somebody with a broken leg that's in a plaster cast for 6 weeks, or who's just had a heart attack. But actually, sort of like what psychiatry has done secularly in our society has sort of appropriated diagnoses. So they've made these labels, which then sort of somehow become professionalized, and it disempowers the church body, the people, the congregation, and many pastors and leaders, because they think, I don't know about those sorts of things. Psychiatry has given this diagnosis. I'm handing over to the professional. Whereas actually we can have professional interactions and support while still sort of being a body of believers and a family that works together, that supports people sort of in their need through really practical sort of examples. It's sometimes about making sure that somebody eats and drinks, as basic as that. And yet often we can withdraw in those situations and circumstances. Has that sort of answered some of the things that you...
And I'd quite like us to continue this chat a bit further.
Sure.
If that's going.
That's excellent.
Okay.